6. Biodiversity conservation and sustainable management of living natural resources. Introduction. Paragraph 1. Environmental and Social Standard 6 recognizes that protecting and conserving biodiversity and sustainably managing living natural resources are fundamental to sustainable development. Biodiversity is defined as the variability among living organisms from all sources, including inter alia, terrestrial, marine, and other aquatic ecosystems, and the ecological complexes of which they are a part. This includes diversity within species, between species, and of ecosystems. Biodiversity often underpins ecosystem services valued by humans. Impacts on biodiversity can therefore often adversely affect the delivery of ecosystem services. Paragraph 2. Environmental and Social Standard 6 recognizes the importance of maintaining core ecological functions of habitats, including forests, and the biodiversity they support. Habitat is defined as a terrestrial, freshwater, or marine geographical unit or airway that supports assemblages of living organisms and their interactions with the non-living environment. All habitats support complexities of living organisms and vary in terms of species diversity, abundance, and importance. Paragraph 3. This environmental and social standard also addresses sustainable management of primary production and harvesting of living natural resources. Paragraph 4. Environmental and Social Standard 6 recognizes the need to consider the livelihood of project-affected parties, including indigenous peoples, whose access to or use of biodiversity or living natural resources may be affected by a project. The potential positive role of project-affected parties, including indigenous peoples, in biodiversity conservation and sustainable management of living natural resources is also considered. Objectives: to protect and conserve biodiversity and habitats, to apply the mitigation hierarchy and the precautionary approach in the design and implementation of projects that could have an impact on biodiversity, to promote the sustainable management of living natural resources, to support livelihoods of local communities, including indigenous peoples, and inclusive economic development through the adoption of practices that integrate conservation needs and development priorities. Scope of application. Paragraph 5. The applicability of this environmental and social standard is established during the environmental and social assessment described in Environmental and Social Standard 1. Paragraph 6. Based on the environmental and social assessment, the requirements of this environmental and social standard are applied to all projects that potentially affect biodiversity or habitats, either positively or negatively, directly or indirectly, or that depend upon biodiversity for their success. Paragraph 7. This environmental and social standard also applies to projects that involve primary production and/or harvesting of living natural resources. Requirements. A. General. Paragraph 8. The environmental and social assessment, as set out in Environmental and Social Standard 1, will consider direct, indirect, and cumulative project-related impacts on habitats and the biodiversity they support. This assessment will consider threats to biodiversity, for example, habitat loss, degradation and fragmentation, invasive alien species, overexploitation, hydrological changes, nutrient loading, pollution and incidental take, as well as projected climate change impacts. It will determine the significance of biodiversity or habitats based on their vulnerability and irreplaceability at a global, regional, or national level, and will also take into account the differing values attached to biodiversity and habitats by project-affected parties and other interested parties. Paragraph 9. The borrower will avoid adverse impacts on biodiversity and habitats. When avoidance of adverse impacts is not possible, the borrower will implement measures to minimize adverse impacts and restore biodiversity in accordance with the mitigation hierarchy provided in Environmental and Social Standard 1, and with the requirements of this environmental and social standard. The borrower will ensure that competent biodiversity expertise is utilized to conduct the environmental and social assessment and the verification of the effectiveness and feasibility of mitigation measures. Where significant risks and adverse impacts on biodiversity have been identified, the borrower will develop and implement a biodiversity management plan. Assessment of risks and impacts. Paragraph 10. Through the environmental and social assessment, the borrower will identify the potential project-related risks to and impacts on habitats and the biodiversity that they support. In accordance with the mitigation hierarchy, the borrower will make the initial assessment of project risks and impacts without taking into account the possibility of biodiversity offsets. The assessment undertaken by the borrower will include identification of the types of habitats potentially affected and consideration of potential risks to and impacts on the ecological function of the habitats. The assessment will encompass any areas of potential biodiversity importance that may be affected by the project, whether or not they are protected under national law. The extent of the assessment will be proportionate to the risks and impacts based on their likelihood, significance, and severity, and will reflect the concerns of project-affected parties and other interested parties. Paragraph 11. The borrower's assessment will include characterization of baseline conditions to a degree that is proportional and specific to the anticipated risk and significance of impacts. In planning and undertaking environmental and social assessment related to the biodiversity baseline, the borrower will follow relevant good international industry practice, utilizing desktop review, consultation with experts, and field-based approaches, as appropriate. Where further investigations are needed to evaluate the significance of potential impacts, the borrower will carry out additional investigation and/or monitoring before undertaking any project-related activities and before taking irrevocable decisions about project design that could cause significant adverse impacts to potentially affected habitats and the biodiversity that they support. Paragraph 12. Where the environmental and social assessment has identified potential risks and impacts on biodiversity or habitats, the borrower will manage those risks and impacts in accordance with the mitigation hierarchy and good international industry practice. The borrower will adopt a precautionary approach and apply adaptive management practices in which the implementation of mitigation and management measures are responsive to changing conditions and the results of project monitoring. Conservation of biodiversity and habitats. Paragraph 13. Habitat is defined as a terrestrial, freshwater, or marine geographical unit or airway that supports assemblages of living organisms and their interactions with the non-living environment. Habitats vary in their significance for conserving globally, regionally, and nationally important biodiversity, their sensitivity to impacts, and in the significance different stakeholders attribute to them. Because in most instances, habitat loss, degradation, or fragmentation represents the greatest threat to biodiversity. Much of the focus of biodiversity conservation actions is on maintaining or restoring suitable habitats. Paragraph 14. This environmental and social standard requires a differentiated risk management approach to habitats based on their sensitivity and values. This environmental and social standard addresses all habitats categorized as modified habitat, natural habitat, and critical habitat, along with legally protected and internationally and regionally recognized areas of biodiversity value, which may encompass habitat in any or all of these categories. Paragraph 15. For the protection and conservation of habitats and the biodiversity they support, the mitigation hierarchy includes biodiversity offsets. Offsets will be considered as a last resort only if significant residual adverse impacts remain after all technically and financially feasible avoidance, minimization, and restoration measures have been considered. Paragraph 16. A biodiversity offset will be designed and implemented to achieve measurable, additional, and long-term conservation outcomes that can reasonably be expected to result in no net loss and preferably a net gain of biodiversity. In the case of an offset used as mitigation for residual adverse impacts on any area of critical habitat, a net gain is required. The design of a biodiversity offset will adhere to the like for like or better principle and will be carried out in alignment with good international industry practice. Paragraph 17. When a borrower is considering the development of an offset as part of the mitigation strategy, stakeholders and qualified experts with demonstrated knowledge in offset design and implementation will be involved. The borrower will demonstrate the long-term technical and financial feasibility of undertaking the offset. When offsets are proposed for residual adverse impacts on critical habitat, the borrower will engage one or more independent, internationally recognized experts to advise as to whether the proposed offset is feasible and whether, in their professional opinion, it can be reasonably expected to result in a sustainable net gain of biodiversity values for which the critical habitat was designated. Paragraph 18. Certain residual adverse impacts cannot be offset, particularly if the affected area is unique and irreplaceable from a biodiversity standpoint. In such cases, the borrower will not undertake the project unless it is redesigned to avoid the need for such offset and to meet the requirements of this environmental and social standard. Modified habitat. Paragraph 19. Modified habitats are areas that may contain a large proportion of plant and/or animal species of non-native origin, and/or where human activity has substantially modified an area's primary ecological functions and species composition. Modified habitats may include, for example, areas managed for agriculture, forest plantations, reclaimed coastal zones, and reclaimed wetlands. Paragraph 20. This environmental and social standard applies to those areas of modified habitat that include significant biodiversity value as determined by the environmental and social assessment required in Environmental and Social Standard 1. The borrower will avoid or minimize impacts on such biodiversity and implement mitigation measures as appropriate. Natural habitat. Paragraph 21. Natural habitats are areas composed of viable assemblages of plant and/or animal species of largely native origin and/or where human activity has not essentially modified an area's primary ecological functions and species composition. Paragraph 22. If natural habitats are identified as part of the assessment, the borrower will seek to avoid adverse impacts on them in accordance with the mitigation hierarchy. Where natural habitats have the potential to be adversely affected by the project, The borrower will not implement any project-related activities unless A. There are no technically and financially feasible alternatives, and B. Appropriate mitigation measures are put in place in accordance with the mitigation hierarchy to achieve no net loss and, where feasible, preferably a net gain of biodiversity over the long term. When residual impacts remain despite best efforts to avoid, minimize, and mitigate impacts, and where appropriate and supported by relevant stakeholders, mitigation measures may include biodiversity offsets, adhering to the principle of like for like or better. Critical habitat. Paragraph 23. Critical habitat is defined as areas with high biodiversity importance or value, including A. Habitat of significant importance to critically endangered or endangered species as listed in the International Union for Conservation of Nature Red List of Threatened Species or equivalent national approaches. B. Habitat of significant importance to endemic or restricted range species. C. Habitat supporting globally or nationally significant concentrations of migratory or congregatory species. D. Highly threatened or unique ecosystems. E. Ecological functions or characteristics that are needed to maintain the viability of the biodiversity values described above in A to D. Paragraph 24. In areas of critical habitat, the borrower will not implement any project activities that have potential adverse impacts unless all of the following conditions are met. A. No other viable alternatives within the region exist for development of the project in habitats of lesser biodiversity value. B. All due process required under international obligations or national law that is a prerequisite to a country granting approval for project activities in or adjacent to a critical habitat has been complied with. C. The potential adverse impacts or likelihood of such on the habitat will not lead to measurable net reduction or negative change in those biodiversity values for which the critical habitat was designated. D. The project is not anticipated to lead to a net reduction in the population of any critically endangered, or restricted range species over a reasonable time period. E. The project will not involve significant conversion or significant degradation of critical habitats. In circumstances where the project involves new or renewed forestry or agricultural plantations, it will not convert or degrade any critical habitat. F. The project's mitigation strategy will be designed to achieve net gains of those biodiversity values for which the critical habitat was designated. And G. A robust and appropriately designed long-term biodiversity monitoring and evaluation program aimed at assessing the status of the critical habitat is integrated into the borrower's management program. Paragraph 25. Where a borrower has satisfied the conditions set out in paragraph 24, the project's mitigation strategy will be described in a biodiversity management plan and set out in the legal agreement, including the environmental and social commitment plan. Legally protected and internationally recognized areas of high biodiversity value. Paragraph 26. Where the project occurs within or has the potential to adversely affect an area that is legally protected, designated for protection, or regionally or internationally recognized, the borrower will ensure that any activities undertaken are consistent with the area's legal protection status and management objectives. The borrower will also identify and assess potential project-related adverse impacts and apply the mitigation hierarchy so as to prevent or mitigate adverse impacts from projects that could compromise the integrity, conservation objectives, or biodiversity importance of such an area. Paragraph 27. The borrower will meet the requirements of paragraphs 13 through 25 of this environmental and social standard as applicable. In addition, the borrower will A. Demonstrate that the proposed development in such areas is legally permitted. B. Act in a manner consistent with any government-recognized management plans for such areas. C. Consult and involve protected area sponsors and managers, project-affected parties, including indigenous peoples, and other interested parties on planning, designing, implementing, monitoring, and evaluating the proposed project as appropriate. And D. Implement additional programs as appropriate to promote and enhance the conservation aims and effective management of the area. Invasive alien species. Paragraph 28. Intentional or accidental introduction of alien or non-native species of flora and fauna into areas where they are not normally found can be a significant threat to biodiversity, since some alien species can become invasive, spreading rapidly and destroying or outcompeting native species. Paragraph 29. The borrower will not intentionally introduce any new alien species not currently established in the country or region of the project unless this is carried out in accordance with the existing regulatory framework for such introduction. Notwithstanding the above, the borrower will not deliberately introduce any alien species with a high risk of invasive behavior, regardless of whether such introductions are permitted under the existing regulatory framework. All introductions of alien species will be subject to a risk assessment as part of the borrower's environmental and social assessment to determine the potential for invasive behavior. The borrower will implement measures to avoid the potential for accidental or unintended introductions, including the transportation of substrates and vectors, such as soil, ballast, and plant materials that may harbor alien species. Paragraph 30. Where alien species are already established in the country or region of the proposed project, the borrower will exercise diligence in not spreading them into areas in which they have not already become established. Where feasible, the borrower will take measures to eradicate such species from the natural habitats over which the borrower has management control. Sustainable management of living natural resources. Paragraph 31. The borrower with projects involving primary production and harvesting of living natural resources will assess the overall sustainability of these activities, as well as their potential impacts on local, nearby, or ecologically linked habitats, biodiversity, and communities, including indigenous peoples. Paragraph 32. The borrower will manage living natural resources in a sustainable manner through the application of good management practices and available technologies. Where such primary production practices are codified in standards that are globally, regionally, or nationally recognized, particularly for industrial scale operations, the borrower and the bank will agree on the standards to be applied. In the absence of relevant standards for the particular living natural resources in the country concerned, the borrower will apply good international industry practice. Paragraph 33. For projects involving small-scale producers, the borrower will require producers to operate in a sustainable manner and to gradually improve their practices where such opportunities exist. Where the project consists of a large number of small producers in the same geographical area, The borrower will assess the potential for cumulative risks and impacts. Paragraph 34. Where the project includes commercial agriculture and forestry plantations, particularly projects involving land clearing or afforestation, the borrower will locate such projects on land that is already converted or highly degraded, excluding any land that has been converted in anticipation of the project. In view of the potential for plantation projects to introduce invasive alien species and threaten biodiversity, such projects will be designed to prevent and mitigate these potential threats to natural habitats. When the borrower invests in production forestry in natural forests, these forests will be managed sustainably. Paragraph 35. Where projects involve harvesting of living natural resources, the borrower will require that these resources are managed in a sustainable manner. In particular, forests and aquatic systems are principal providers of these resources and need to be managed as specified below. A. For projects involving industrial-scale commercial forest harvesting operations, the borrower will ensure such operations are certified under an independent forest certification system or adhere to a time-bound phased action plan acceptable to the bank for achieving certification to such a system. B. For projects involving forest harvesting operations conducted by small-scale producers, by local communities under community forest management, or by such entities under joint forest management arrangements, where such operations are not directly associated with an industrial-scale operation, the borrower will ensure that they, Roman numeral 1, have achieved a standard of sustainable forest management developed with the meaningful participation of project-affected parties, including indigenous peoples, consistent with the principles and criteria of sustainable forest management, even if not formally certified. O, Roman numeral 2, adhere to a time-bound action plan to achieve such a standard. The action plan will be developed with the meaningful participation of project-affected parties and be acceptable to the bank. The borrower will ensure that all such operations are monitored with the meaningful participation of project-affected parties. C. For projects involving industrial-scale harvesting of fish populations and all other types of marine and freshwater organisms, the borrower will demonstrate that their activities are being undertaken in a sustainable manner consistent with the principles and criteria for sustainable harvesting. Paragraph 36. For projects that do not involve primary production or harvesting of living natural resources and entail salvage logging, for example, in areas to be inundated, the borrower will limit cleared areas to a minimum and justified by the project's technical requirements, and that relevant national legislation is being followed. Paragraph 37. The borrower involved in the industrial production of crops and animal husbandry will follow good international industry practice to avoid or minimize adverse risks or impacts. The borrower involved in large-scale commercial farming, including breeding, rearing, housing, transport, and slaughter of animals for meat or other animal products, such as milk, eggs, wool, will employ good international industry practice in animal husbandry techniques with due consideration for religious and cultural principles. B. Primary suppliers. Paragraph 38. Where a borrower is purchasing natural resource commodities, including food, timber, and fiber, that are known to originate from areas where there is a risk of significant conversion or significant degradation of natural or critical habitats, the borrower's environmental and social assessment will include an evaluation of the systems and verification practices used by the primary suppliers. Paragraph 39. The borrower will establish systems and verification practices which will A. Identify where the supply is coming from and the habitat type of the source area. B. Where possible, limit procurement to those suppliers that can demonstrate that they are not contributing to significant conversion or degradation of natural or critical habitats. And C. Where possible and within a reasonable period, shift the borrower's primary suppliers to suppliers that can demonstrate that they are not significantly adversely impacting these areas. Paragraph 40. The ability of the borrower to fully address these risks will depend upon the borrower's level of control or influence over its primary suppliers.